UK, prisons have failed to recognise the dangers of Muslim gangs and convicted jihad terrorists. April 30, 2022. It should be obvious, supervisors in prisons should control the inmates, but like other authorities in other contexts, everyone succumbs to timidity. The UK has lost its role in the national endeavour to reduce the risk of terrorism, as some Muslim inmates impose their own rules on inmates and staff and are even allowed to raise Islamic State flags in their cells. This free-for-all for jihadists and hate preachers in jail didn't happen overnight. The Daily Mail reported 6 years ago that political correctness in Britain's jails has allowed Islamic extremism to flourish behind bars. As usual, nothing was done. Too many prison authorities are driven by fear of being called racists and Islamophobes. Jurist also reported about the findings discussed below and described the severe, intolerable conditions under which disbelievers are oppressed and in danger in UK jails. The report found evidence of a highly structured Muslim gang culture in prisons, fostered by faith-based privileges such as separate food, places of prayer and prayer times. Individuals convicted of serious offences gain influence within these gangs and go on to groom other prisoners to commit violence against non-Muslim prisoners and prison officers. Prisoners attempted to commit attacks in prison, celebrated terror attacks by shouting violent Islamist slogans and smuggled prison contraband, including audiovisual terror propagandist material, a process simultaneously buoyed by a 26% cut in prison staff between 2010 and 2017. Once released from jails, jihadists will resume their jihad. America is no different, as federal prisons are described by experts as breeding grounds for terrorists. Prison Terrorism, Warnings over Failure to Stop Radicalization, by Daniel Sanford, BBC News, April 27, 2022. The prison service has failed to recognize the dangers Islamist gangs and convicted terrorists pose inside jail, a report warns. The independent reviewer of terrorist legislation, Jonathan Hall QC, said prisons must not provide opportunities for militants to plan new attacks. But the service had lost its role in the national endeavour to reduce the risk of terrorism. The Ministry of Justice said it was committed to isolating radicalizers. More than 200 inmates are in prison after being convicted under terrorism legislation. A similar number convicted of other offences are considered a terrorist risk. No-go area. Mr. Hall's report, Terrorism in Prisons, was commissioned after a recently released prisoner Usman Khan killed Saskia Jones and Jack Merritt at Fishmongers Hall, London Bridge, in November 2019. The impact of Islamist groups in prison had been underappreciated, Mr. Hall said. And the discussion of religion, and Islam in particular, had become a no-go area for prison staff. Rather than tackling Islamist gangs in prisons, staff sometimes use the leaders or emirs to help maintain good order, the report says. Prisoners had even tried to exclude staff from Friday prayers or imposed conditions such as staff removing shoes. Mr. Hall also found prisoners being excluded from kitchens unless they avoided certain foods. There was no national dashboard for highlighting where Islamist gangs were active or on the rise in the prison system, he said. Hateful beliefs. After an earlier review, the prison service built 3 separation centers, prisons within prisons where the most influential radicalizers could be kept away from the other inmates. The 3 centers, at HMP Frankland, HMP Woodhill and HMP Full Sutton, have 28 places. But only 15 inmates have ever been in one, partly because of the complicated process of referring prisoners to them and the fear of challenges, after some argued it would breach their right to a private life under the Human Rights Act. Deputy Prime Minister and Justice Secretary Dominic Raab said this was one of the reasons for his proposed Bill of Rights. He told BBC Radio 4's Today programme some prisoners will poison the well, they will radicalise if they are left in general population, and they will ultimately recruit more terrorists. The Deputy PM said £1.2 million was being spent to beef up the teams which identify extremists who should be moved into separation centres. He also wants to increase the number of places in close supervision centres in England and Wales, where the most violent prisoners are held, from 50 to 60. In his report, Mr. Hall warned that public confidence in the criminal justice system is shaken if terrorism occurs in prison or if people enter prison only to come out more dangerous. His Majesty Prison and Probation Service's real-life encounters with terrorist ideology and violence over the past 15 years ought to make staff more confident that their goal is legitimate and not Islamophobic, he added. Mr. Hall said it was important that counter-terrorism policing got more involved in investigating terrorist offending behind bars. He was concerned that some offending in prison might get lost in a patchwork of responsibility.